Hey, Larken Rose here. Why is slavery bad? Now, before anybody flips out, I'm not suggesting that it's not bad. But when things are bad, if you understand principles and some basic level of philosophy, you can describe what's bad about them, why they're bad, the fundamental part of them that is immoral. So, when it comes to slavery, what fundamental part of that is immoral? Now, you can point out that people in slavery suffered horribly, mentally, physically, in every way you can imagine. Does that make it bad? Well, no. Because lots of people who moved into the wilderness, they suffered horribly. They had to work really, really hard. They were on the brink of starvation. They, got attacked by bears and mountain lions and stuff. The fact that something hurts and causes suffering doesn't mean it's immoral. But when a human being causes suffering to another human being, that we recognize as immoral. We don't say, oh, you're such an evil mountain lion for attacking somebody. That's what mountain lions do. We expect better, or at least we wish for better, from human beings. But let's get specific about why slavery is bad. And it may seem like a weird thing to talk about because, obviously it's bad. It's about as bad as you can get to claim to own another human being and then treat them as property. Okay, yes, that's obvious. Not disagreeing with that. But can you put into words the principles involved? Now, I'm just going to throw in, if you haven't yet seen the Jones Plantation movie, why not? Go watch it. JonesPlantationFilm.com. If somebody is enslaved, old-fashioned plantation slavery, and they're suffering, they're being forced to work for somebody else, the fruits of their labor is being stolen, they're being brutally, assaulted and whipped and all that stuff. Obviously, that's wrong, but can you define why that's wrong? I can define why that's wrong, because every human being owns himself. And that's just a shorthand way of saying that each person has the right, the exclusive right, to decide what is done with his life and his time and his energy and his thoughts and all of that. Now, one of the things he may choose to do is he may choose to, for example, trade his labor for somebody else paying him. And if he voluntarily chooses to do that, cool, no problem. If he is forced to do that, that's not okay. And that's the difference between voluntary trade and slavery. So, let's consider a few things. I realize this question may seem kind of silly at the moment, but you're going to see why I'm asking it in just a second. Imagine there's a slave master who buys some slaves back in the day when people thought they could own other people. And he says, I'm much nicer than the other slave masters. I only make my slaves work 4 days a week. And in fact, only 7 hours a day for those 4 days. The other 3, they don't have to work at all. Also, I rarely whip them. They have to do something really bad for me to whip them. I use other punishments. Now, they're not free to leave, and I do take the fruits of their labor, and I don't have their consent for that. But I'm so much nicer than the others. Now, would that make it okay if demonstrably they were physically more comfortable, the slaves? They were more comfortable, they weren't brutalized as often, they weren't worked as hard. Would that make it okay? Is it okay to own people if you're nicer to them? I hope we would all agree, no, wouldn't be okay. Still slavery, still 100% wrong. And the fact that, being owned by a nicer, less sadistic master may on a daily basis mean less suffering and direct hardship, it doesn't make it okay. Doesn't mean he rightfully owns you. What if he uses different terminology? Well, you're not allowed to leave, but we're not going to call it slavery anymore. We're going to call it community service or something, and we're going to pretend it's something else. Would that make it okay? I hope we all agree that changing the words you use to describe it doesn't make it okay. What if some plantation owner was successful enough that he could provide much better shelter and food and clothing and things like that to his slaves? Would that make it okay? Now, it would make their lives more comfortable, less suffering. Does that at all justify slavery? Does that at all make it okay? No. Okay, so what's the principle? Self-ownership. They still get to decide what they're doing. Being nice to your human livestock, or nicer, doesn't make it okay. It may make them suffer a little bit less, but it doesn't make it okay. Now, am I stating the bleeding obvious? Yes. Here's why I'm pointing this out. What if not only do you let your slaves have a bunch of stuff so that they're pretty comfortable, you still force them to work. You still decide how much of the fruits of their labor you're going to take and how much you're going to let them keep. And you might let them keep enough that they're kind of comfortable and they have something to lose. And they might look at other plantations and go, well, this is pretty good, all things considered, compared to those other places where they're whipped and they're like on the brink of starvation and stuff. So I'm not going to complain. Would that make it okay? What's the element that makes it not okay? The violation of consent, the violation of self-ownership. And we agree, I hope, that changing the words you use doesn't have any impact on whether it's moral and legitimate and justified or not. Calling it something different doesn't change it. Even though one slave may have a much more comfortable existence than a different slave, they're both 100% wrong. Both forms of slavery are 100% wrong because they violate consent, they violate the concept of self-ownership. What if you call it being a citizen instead of being a slave? And instead of slave master or plantation owner, we call that guy representative government. And instead of just stealing what you produce and acknowledging that, yeah, I can take what I want, we refer to it as an income tax to help pay for the costs of society and civilization and yada, yada, yada. But that group still can decide how much of the fruits of your labor, for example, they're going to take without your consent. And they might leave you a whole bunch so that you're pretty comfortable and you have a car and you have a big screen TV and have a whole lot easier, more comfortable standard of living than plantation slaves had, like by a gigantic margin. Would that make it okay? That there's a group of people forcibly confiscating the fruits of other people's labor without their consent. Now, what if we go one step further? And the slave master, instead of saying, well, I'm taking this, oh, I'm your servant now. I'm representing you when I do this. But because this looks kind of like I'm still just robbing you, I'll tell you what. I will let you choose between me and somebody almost just like me. One of us is going to steal from you a pretty big chunk of the fruits of your labor. We're going to leave you enough that you have something to lose. So you're less inclined to like fight back or run away, or we're going to try to keep you comfortable enough that you keep going along with this scheme. But we're going to let you choose between two people who are both going to rob you and boss you around. But if you choose, we're then going to say that you consented to it, that you agreed. You made this legitimate because you played the game to decide which one of us was going to deprive you of the fruits of your labor. Would that make it okay? It's not called the same thing. It's not represented the same way. They use different terminology. The level of comfort of the people being robbed is much, much higher. The level of outright physical brutal abuse is much, much lower, generally speaking. But you're still forced to do it, and they still send men with guns after you to do nasty things to you if you don't pay tribute to the master. I mean, to the representative government that's there to serve you. So tell me, aside from the rhetoric and the terminology, why is that okay? Well, it's necessary. Does necessity make something evil into something good? Let's pretend that it's necessary. And by the way, you could, and some did, make the case that when there was outright plantation slavery, a lot of those slaves wouldn't know what to do with freedom because they had never experienced it. They had grown up being treated as somebody else's property. They didn't know how to take care of themselves. That was totally true. Does that make it okay for them to be owned? Well, you don't really know what you're doing, so this is for your own good that I'll treat you like property. No, didn't make it okay. This is necessary for your prosperity, and like, we're giving you these things. Does that make it okay? No. How about when they point out, well, you ungrateful slave, I mean citizen, look at all the things we give you. We gave you shelter, and we gave you food, and we gave you tools to work with. We give you health care. We give you just the right amount of education so that you blindly obey us, but don't think too much so that you actually figure out it's all a scam and start disobeying. We give you all these things. Yeah, we force you to hand over the fruits of your labor, and we steal as much as we want. We decide the tax rates. We take as much as we want, and we decide how much to let you keep. It's up to us, it's not up to you. You can whine every few years, but at the end of the day, it's still up to us, not up to you. But after we force you to give us the fruits of your labor, we then give you some stuff. So does that make it okay? Well, did that make it okay in the days of chattel slavery? Because the master did provide them with clothing and shelter and food, and it wasn't good clothing or shelter or food, but provided them with some of that. Does that make it okay? Well, now it's okay that you enslaved them because then you gave them some stuff. Would anybody accept that as a rational moral argument? I hope not. That's loony. How many people say, well, you can't complain about being taxed because look at all the things government gives you? Oh, really? So forcibly robbing people, demanding the fruits of their labor without their consent wasn't their idea. It retroactively becomes okay if you give them some stuff after the fact. So, for example, if I rob you at gunpoint, but tomorrow I bring you a sandwich, now you're not allowed to complain about the robbery? Is that how principles work? Is that how morality works? Because, hey, you benefited from the robbery because I bought you a sandwich. See, I mean, most of it I kept, and I wasted a whole bunch, and I still violently robbed you to begin with, but I gave you a sandwich, so how dare you complain? Nobody would accept that as a justification, as a valid excuse, unless you call it government. And then the vast majority of people not only accept that excuse, that insane, irrational lunacy, they repeat it themselves. Well, how dare you not want to pay your taxes? Look at the roads we get, and the schools we get, and the blah, blah, blah we get. So it doesn't matter if somebody forcibly robs you as long as they give you whatever they decide to give you. Not what you wanted. Not like an arrangement where you can choose to give the fruits of your labor to somebody in exchange for whatever. Being able to send your kid to school, or fixing potholes in a road, or having people protect you from invaders or thugs. No, not the version where you get to pick. The version where the service provider decides what they're going to do for you, and you have no choice in the matter, decides what you're going to pay for it, and you have no choice in the matter, and then pretends that you consented, and that because you benefited by them giving you some little trinket of nothing after they rob you of a huge amount of your lifeblood, of your time and energy, does that make it okay? You tell me. Another way to ask that is, how many ways do they have to rephrase and reword and twist and mangle their description of reality before you'll think slavery is okay? Sadly, the answer is, they don't have to do all that much to make most of you accept something that in principle is evil for the exact same reason that chattel slavery was evil. Doesn't mean we're that uncomfortable. Doesn't mean we're that openly physically brutalized. We can be prosperous. We can be comfortable. We can have lots to lose. And yet, the principle remains the same. The group of people forcibly stealing the fruits of everybody else's labor is immoral. The question is, are you capable, of thinking enough in terms of principles so that the indoctrination you were taught doesn't get in the way of you recognizing what is actually happening? Set aside their euphemisms, their vague terminology, their fluffy BS about it's a servant government that represents you and does the will of the people. Never mind what they say. What do? They demand your money. When you earn $1, they demand some of it. When you spend $1, they demand some of it. When you sit there holding $1, they steal some of that by way of inflation, but that's a different thing that most people don't understand. Does that become okay because afterwards they gave you some level of something? Can you describe in principle why slavery is bad, but government is okay? Good luck.